You ever have something in your life that's more than the thing itself, like it holds a story, a memory, a stubborn kind of belonging? For me, it was a dented, ancient pickup that smelled like oil and campfire, a truck I fixed with my own hands and called Rosie, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, that truck became the bridge between a quiet life and the kind of fight I never wanted. It started on a porch one lazy Saturday, and by the way it ended, it left our whole little street different, not better or worse, just more honest about who we were willing to stand up to. Rosie had been in my family longer than my house. She was the kind of vehicle you don't buy new. You inherit the rattles, the stories, the sticky cup holders, and you treat every scratch like a medal. I'd been a mechanic most of my life, and the truck was where I kept the tools I couldn't bear to lose: an old radio, a thermos with dented paint, a faded postcard from a lake my dad loved. Lila joked that I loved Rosie like a stubborn dog. I'd talk to her while I worked, like she answered back with a creak of the seat. That kind of attachment looks small until someone decides it's in their way. Her name was Margaret Hale, HOA president, Homeowner Association royalty in Maple Hollow, a place where the grass got judged before the people did. Margaret believed neighborhoods were a set of rules to be enforced, and enforcement was a hobby, with her son, Darren, as her willing apprentice. She could smile like a blessing and go home and rewrite the way people parked. She had a way of turning petty into power: a letter here, a complaint there, until people started to feel like they were walking through the sharp edges of someone else's small pleasures. The first real thing that changed was a note stuck to Rosie's windshield. Violation, unregistered vehicle. I laughed and peeled it off, the laugh a little too loud. Margaret knocked on the door the next day, perfume like a briefcase, and said, "You really ought to think about how that truck represents the neighborhood." She said it like she was doing me a favor, as if I'd been a mistake that needed correcting. "We like uniformity," she told me. "It's better for property values. There's hate that shouts and hate that arranges itself politely." Margaret was the second. After that, it was a slow campaign of small things: a bogus complaint to the county about an expired tag, a formal letter suggesting we consider moving the truck to storage for the safety of the community. It was harassment wrapped in stationery, and I felt it like a pebble in my shoe until the pebble became a stone. I don't tell you this to make Margaret a cartoon villain. She had reasons, or at least the kind of self-rationalizations that people use to sleep at night. She lived by the rulebook and watched the neighborhood like it was a math problem she could solve. The problem was Rosie wasn't just a vehicle. It carried my history, Lila's patience, our son Connor's first job of pulling nails on the trailer. The thing Margaret wanted sanitized felt to us like an erasure. One night, after a particularly tense HOA meeting where Margaret read a passage about community standards and smiled like she'd just closed a deal, I caught Darren hovering near the driveway. He pretended to be tying his shoe while he took a photo of Rosie. When I called him out, he shrugged like he'd been doing the neighborhood a favor. "Just documenting," he said, as if evidence were charity. Maybe I should have gone to the meeting. Maybe I should have stayed quieter. But the moment everything flipped was the night the truck nearly left the yard. Lila and I were at dinner when the porch camera, which she'd insisted we get after the note, pinged my phone. 2 teens, a pickup truck with an unfamiliar trailer, and movement that didn't belong. I felt something hollow in my chest. Lila looked at the footage and her face tightened. "Jack," she said, "call the police." I called. I did more than that. I called Officer Ramirez, the patrol who knew us by name because of all the times we fixed things belonging to people who'd never say thanks. He came over and watched the footage, and his jaw went stiff in a way that made me take it seriously for the first time. We didn't rush out like heroes. We watched. We let the footage gather proof. I won't tell you the step-by-step of how we kept the truck safe. That's not the point, but there's a difference between being brave and being reckless, and the line is the one where someone gets hurt. We chose the kind of action that could stand up in a courtroom, not just on a porch. When Darren and a friend tried to roll Rosie down the street in the thick of night, radios in their hands, it felt like something slow-motion movies. You can predict the beats and still be surprised by the fear in your gut. Connor, Lila, and I were ready. We had a calmness that surprised me, the kind that comes from knowing what you love and being willing to protect it without losing yourself in the anger. The truck stalled, like a sudden apology. Darren swore and waved his hands, his bravado turning brittle when he realized cameras were rolling and neighbors were awake and calling the station. He tried to point fingers, to play the victim like he'd been practicing lines. That's when Margaret showed up, standing there in a robe, the light haloing her shoulders like some small deity who'd been disturbed. Her voice cut the air. "What are you doing?" she asked, but it was the kind of question that put blame into motion. I wish I could say truth arrived as a thunderclap, that everyone saw what they needed to see in an instant. Instead, truth in our neighborhood was more like a slow curtain pulling back. Text from Darren to his mom, "We did it like you said," were a line of evidence that read like a confession. Margaret tried to twist it into something else. She accused us of making a scene, of staging the whole thing for attention. But the county officer who took the statements listened to the footage with his head tilted, like someone reading a paragraph that didn't belong to the story Margaret wanted to tell. There's a moment after confrontation when you realize you've crossed something, not a line so much as a threshold. That's when the formal world arrives, a detective with an even calmer voice than a patrol officer, documents that smelled of seriousness, an investigator who asked questions without a hint of judgment, but with a clarity that felt like daylight. We sat at the table as they asked us to describe things, to point out inconsistencies, to narrate our lives in a way that made legal sense. Lila answered without theatrics, and there was a steadiness to her that I admire even now. The HOA tried to fight back with procedure letters, a hastily convened meeting, a call for community review. Margaret stood up in the meeting and gave a speech about protecting property values that sounded like an old song she'd sung 100 times. But people had already seen the footage. Mrs. Patel from down the street, who'd always kept to herself, stood up and said, "We deserve someone who represents us, not someone who uses rules like a weapon." That line landed heavy. The room shifted. We ended up in a hearing where the truth had been packaged into things like timestamps, text messages, and recorded statements. Margaret pleaded something that tasted like regret, but read like self-preservation. The outcome was not a movie final, no dramatic courtroom confession, no instant redemption. She faced fines, a suspension from the HOA board, and an order to attend mediation. The law doesn't always give you the satisfying payback you imagine in the heat of it, but it will sometimes do what your neighbors won't. Put the facts on paper and let them stand there in front of everyone. The deeper thing that changed wasn't the legal record, it was how the street looked the next summer. People waved again without calculating whether the wave was approved. Connor could drive Rosie down to the hardware store and come back with a smile instead of furtive checks over his shoulder. Margaret, for all her public posture, had to repair relationships she'd burned. She learned in the slow way some people do that power used for policing others rarely buys you genuine respect. I learned other things. I learned the shape of my own courage, that it's less about fireworks and more about steady, stubborn refusal to let your life be rearranged by someone else's sense of order. I learned Lila's fear was not cowardice but care. Her insistence on cameras and records was a kind of love that sees consequences before they arrive. And Connor, he learned to stand on the side of truth, even when truth meant confronting someone older, someone with a nicer suit. He learned how to hold a camera steady in a moment that mattered. There's a little scene that still sits with me. The morning after the hearing, I was in the driveway rubbing polish into Rosie's fender, and Mrs. Patel walked by with a pie. She didn't give it to us because we'd won. She gave it to us because she knew what it meant to have someone keep something of your family safe. She said, "We're sorry it took so long." And I said, "It's all right. We did it the right way." That felt like something stronger than victory. It felt like a community reclaiming itself. If there's a messy moral here, it's that power is often invisible until someone points a camera at it. It's not always the loudest person who's right. The story isn't about punishment. It's about consequence, the idea that when rules become a weapon for one person, everyone else has to be brave enough to step up and say, no. It's about the truck that, for us, was not metal but memory, and about the way memory can make you stubborn in the best possible way. So, if you've watched this far, I want to hear from you. What would you have done? Have you ever had a neighbor push the line so far that you had to step in? Tell me where you stand, community order or community freedom, and what that balance looks like where you live. Share, argue, disagree, that's the point. If this story made you think, drop a comment and let me know why. If it struck a nerve, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have a story about a little truck that meant everything, I'll read it.